In the winter of 1941, deep in the folds of Kentucky's Clay County, a cabin stood like a scar against the frozen hillsides. The home of the Griffin family was a place neighbors whispered about but rarely approached. It had no light except the weak glow of a fire that barely touched its corners, and no sound except the muffled cries of children who almost never stepped into daylight. The Griffin name had been known in these parts for generations, but by the early 1940s their house became less a home and more a sealed chamber where secrets grew thicker than the smoke staining the rafters. Inside were Tom Griffin, a hard-faced man of the hills, and his wife Sarah, who had not been seen in town for over a decade. Between them were 3 children, John, Mary, and Caleb, whose faces carried marks that frightened those few who had glimpsed them. Their mouths grew too wide, their teeth angled in ways that looked unnatural, and their hollowed features gave the impression of masks more than faces. Neighbors said the children never smiled. Some insisted they could not. The Griffins explained little. When questioned, Tom would say only that their appearance was family resemblance, a trace of bloodline carried too strongly. He dismissed all curiosity, and his sharp eyes discouraged further questions. Yet unease spread through the valley. Children whispered about the hollow-faced ones when gathering wood, and elders lowered their voices when discussing the Griffin place. Still, no one dared intervene. The cabin seemed cut off, as though the forest itself conspired to protect its secret. By day, the children were kept inside, their steps muffled against dirt floors. At night, faint lamplight revealed them peering through cracks in the boards, watching the outside world like captives. Their mother, Sarah, sat close to them, her thin hands pulling them near whenever a branch snapped or footsteps sounded outside. For years, she avoided the eyes of anyone beyond her own walls. In town, whispers said she had gone strange, lost to silence and shadows. But in early spring of 1942, a change came. A school teacher named Miss Evelyn Moore, recently moved from another county, noticed the Griffin children had never been enrolled in any class. Their names were absent from records, their ages unmarked, their very existence only confirmed through rumor. Against warnings, she walked the ridge road to their cabin, carrying books beneath her arm, determined to see them. What she found behind that sagging door chilled her more than the mountain winds ever had. She would later say the children looked at her as though they had never seen another human beyond their parents. Their words stumbled, broken, almost unformed, as if speech itself was foreign to them. Their faces, haunting, fragile, unforgettable, seemed carved from suffering rather than born from joy. Evelyn Moore stepped back from that doorway with her heart heavy, realizing she could not leave this house unseen, not when the children inside had never truly stepped into the world. Evelyn Moore walked back down the muddy ridge path with the sensation that eyes were still on her from behind the boarded cracks. She held her books tightly against her chest, her shoes sinking into soft earth, her mind already torn between duty and fear. The images of John, Mary, and Caleb followed her, faces pale in the dim cabin light, lips struggling with syllables, voices barely clinging to language itself. That night she sat in her rented room above the post office, staring at the ceiling while coal smoke drifted through thin walls. Her hands shook as she tried to write a letter of concern, yet she stopped, crumpled the paper, and began again. Every sentence faltered between exposing what she had seen and the dread of what might follow. She wondered how long the Griffin children had been hidden from the eyes of neighbors, how many winters had passed without a doctor's visit, without lessons, without laughter. When Evelyn returned to school the next day, she asked her fellow teachers if they had ever seen the Griffin children. Their silence answered before their words did. Most shook their heads quickly, others looked away, unwilling to dwell on it. One elderly teacher muttered that the Griffins keep to themselves and warned Evelyn not to stir up old dust. But she had already breathed in the dust of that cabin, already heard the broken rhythm of voices that barely counted as speech. Something in her could not stay silent. By the week's end, she brought her concerns to the county welfare office, her voice trembling as she described the cabin, the children's appearances, their silence. The clerk, a tired man with ink-stained fingers, listened half-heartedly, yet paused when Evelyn spoke of their speechlessness. He frowned, scribbled notes, and finally muttered that a caseworker would look into it. Still, Evelyn left the office with a pit in her stomach, unsure whether anything would be done. The Griffins themselves seemed aware that new eyes had turned toward them. Tom was seen once in town soon after, sharper in his gaze than usual, his voice curt when buying supplies. He carried more than he needed, almost as if he was bracing for intrusion. Sarah did not appear. Those who crossed Tom's path that day remembered his silence, how he seemed to measure every face as though searching for betrayal. Back in the hills, the children sensed change. John, the eldest, stood at the window crack at dusk, watching the road. His small hands clutched the sill, his hollow face pressed against splintered wood. Mary sat beside their mother, brushing at her worn dress, while Caleb hummed a sound without melody, rocking slightly as if echoing the tension in the air. For Evelyn Moore, the choice weighed heavier by the day. Remain quiet and let shadows thicken, or force the valley to confront what was locked inside the Griffin cabin. Her decision soon drew others into its orbit, though not in the way she first imagined. The county assigned a caseworker, Mrs. Florence Allen, a woman in her late 40s whose voice carried the calm, deliberate tone of someone who had seen many fractured families. Evelyn accompanied her up the ridge one gray morning in April, the path slick with dew and the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. When they reached the cabin, Tom Griffin stood at the door, his arms crossed, his face set like stone. His presence filled the doorway as though he alone guarded the threshold to another world. Mrs. Allen explained her purpose with steady politeness, but Tom's replies were short, clipped, and cold. Still, he did not close the door. Perhaps curiosity or defiance kept him rooted there. Behind him, Sarah hovered in the shadows, her eyes wide and rimmed with exhaustion. It was then that Mrs. Allen saw them. The children appeared silently, their steps slow, their eyes cast down as though ashamed to meet a stranger's gaze. She noted the thinness of their limbs, the way their faces seemed almost skeletal, marked by sharp angles and irregular lines. But what unsettled her most was not the deformity. It was the absence of natural expression. Their mouths moved awkwardly, as if testing whether to form words, but the sounds never fully became sentences. Mrs. Allen later described the scene in her notes. The children seem unpracticed in speech, almost as if language itself is unfamiliar. Their eyes follow, but their mouths lag behind. Their silence weighs heavier than hunger. She urged Tom to consider medical attention, schooling, and nourishment programs. His reply was curt, "My children are mine. They need no strangers." The tension thickened until Sarah stepped forward. Her hand brushed against Mary's shoulder with a trembling gentleness, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She simply looked at Mrs. Allen with an expression somewhere between plea and resignation. That silent moment said more than Tom's guarded defiance ever could. On their return down the ridge, Evelyn asked Mrs. Allen what she thought should be done. The older woman sighed, folded her notebook against her chest, and answered that the case was troubling but uncertain. "Families here hold their secrets tight," she said softly. "But those children, they are not growing as children should." Evelyn knew she was right. That week, Mrs. Allen filed her report, careful but firm, placing emphasis on the children's lack of speech, and the mother's withdrawn state. Yet in small counties, papers pile high and urgency can fade. Evelyn feared this report would sink like a stone into dark water. She began gathering her own evidence, determined that the children of the Griffin cabin would not vanish into silence again. Evelyn Moore's steps became measured with purpose. She spoke quietly to neighbors, asked about the family's past, and tried to trace their roots through records kept in the courthouse. But what she found only deepened the mystery. Marriage documents, birth registries, and census rolls revealed tangled patterns. Names repeated across generations, cousins listed as siblings, and gaps where records should have been. One document in particular caught her attention, a marriage certificate dated 1923, uniting Tom Griffin with a woman listed as Sarah Mae Griffin. At first, Evelyn assumed it was Sarah, the same weary mother she had seen in the cabin. But the birth year didn't match. This Sarah Mae had been recorded as born in 1888, far older than the woman Evelyn had met. The discovery rattled her. Was it clerical error, or did it mean something far stranger, that perhaps Sarah was not who she appeared to be, or that another generation bore the same name? She carried her concerns to the county historian, a retired schoolmaster named Arthur McDaniel. He pulled weathered ledgers from his shelves, his fingers stained with the dust of decades. Evelyn explained what she had found, and he studied the records with narrowing eyes. "These hills," he said softly, "have long memories but poor paper trails. Families double back on themselves. Sometimes a name repeats so many times, outsiders lose track of who's who." He cautioned her not to leap to conclusions. Still, Evelyn couldn't shake the image of Sarah's hollow stare and wondered if it belonged to a story older and darker than anyone admitted. But the rumor mill churned quickly. Whispers spread that Evelyn had discovered proof of unlawful ties within the Griffin line. Neighbors exchanged hushed theories by lamplight, their voices tinged with both horror and fascination. Some swore Sarah was Tom's cousin, others muttered she might have been his niece, while a few even claimed she was older kin who had passed herself as younger. These speculations fed the valley's fear, painting the Griffins as more than reclusive. They became symbols of something forbidden. Yet when Evelyn returned to Arthur McDaniel for clarity, he surprised her. The supposed certificate she had found turned out to belong to another Griffin branch entirely, a family that had left Clay County years before. The dates and names had been misfiled, tangled in the poor record-keeping of the courthouse. The historian leaned back, exhaling with a kind of wearied finality. "This line may be troubled," he admitted, "but sometimes the truth is simpler than the shadows we cast upon it." Evelyn left that day with more questions than answers. The false lead had shaken her resolve, but not her determination. If anything, it made her more certain that beneath the surface of clerical errors and town gossip, the real truth still waited inside that cabin, sealed in silence. Evelyn Moore returned once more to the welfare office, pressing harder this time. Her voice carried the weight of desperation as she urged officials to act. Mrs. Florence Allen, though sympathetic, warned her that forcing entry without cause could turn the community against them. Yet Evelyn insisted that silence was itself the cause, that silence was killing those children as surely as hunger or cold. Weeks passed, and spring turned into the heavy heat of summer. It was then that the first sign of illness appeared. Caleb, the youngest, was seen by a neighbor staggering outside the cabin, his breath ragged, his chest rattling with each cough. The sound carried across the holler, and even those hardened by poverty and hardship could not ignore it. That evening, a doctor was finally summoned under county order, though Tom fought bitterly against his presence. Dr. Samuel Keller, a physician who had tended mountain families for 30 years, was the one to cross the Griffin threshold. His report would later describe a scene of neglect that went beyond poverty. He found children underfed, their skin pale and fragile, their teeth misaligned in ways that suggested more than poor nutrition. Their bodies were thin, but their eyes, those hollow, searching eyes, spoke of something deeper. A life without growth, without play, without the rhythm of ordinary childhood. Most striking to Dr. Keller was their speech, or rather the absence of it. Words came haltingly, strung together with difficulty, as though they had been deprived of language during their most vital years. He wrote that their silence was not simply chosen, but imposed by years of isolation. Caleb's cough, however, was real and worsening. The boy clutched his sides with every convulsion, and Sarah hovered near him, her trembling hands useless against his fever. For the first time in years, Sarah spoke more than a whisper. Her voice cracked as she pleaded for medicine, for anything that could ease her son's suffering. Tom stood apart, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides, but even he could not deny the boy's condition. Dr. Keller left with samples and promised treatment, though he carried with him the unmistakable conviction that what ailed the Griffin children went far beyond disease. That night, Evelyn sat awake by lamplight, replaying Sarah's broken words in her mind. It was the first proof that beneath her silence, there remained a mother's voice desperate to protect her children. Evelyn realized then that what was hidden inside the Griffin home was not only deformity or neglect, but a slow erasure of humanity itself. Leave a comment if you believe truth must always be revealed, no matter how hidden. She carried that thought with her as she prepared to visit the cabin once more, this time not as a teacher or neighbor, but as someone determined to uncover what the walls themselves seemed to conceal. The illness had cracked open the family's defenses, and for the first time, Sarah appeared to want outside help. When Evelyn stepped inside again, she found Sarah sitting close to Caleb, who was wrapped in blankets, his thin chest rising and falling unevenly. Mary and John sat near the fire, silent as always, their faces caught between curiosity and fear. Tom stood apart, pacing like a man trapped between fury and resignation. He muttered that outsiders make things worse, but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. That afternoon, Evelyn noticed something she had missed before, a small trunk tucked beneath the bed. Its lock was broken, and inside were scraps of paper, letters, notes, and fragments of writing. Some bore Sarah's handwriting, shaky but desperate. Others carried Tom's heavier script. Among them were half-finished letters that seemed never sent. One note in particular chilled Evelyn. Sarah had written of nights when the children cried without words, and of her fear that their silence was more than mere neglect, that it was the price of our own blood binding too close. When confronted gently, Sarah lowered her head. Her hands twisted the fabric of her dress, and tears welled in her eyes. She whispered that their children were marked, not by illness alone, but by the choices of kin who had bound themselves too tightly in generations past. She never named names, but her broken confession revealed more than Tom had ever admitted. For Evelyn, the truth came into focus. The Griffin line was not only isolated by geography, but also by the weight of forbidden bonds carried forward in silence. That night, Evelyn shared what she had learned with Dr. Keller. The physician listened grimly, his brow furrowed, his hand pressed against his chin. He spoke of medical conditions born from confined lineages, explaining how repeated closeness within a family could twist features, weaken bodies, and dull the natural spark of language. He stressed that while poverty and isolation played their part, the roots of the Griffin children's suffering were tangled in generations of hidden ties. Evelyn left that meeting with her resolve sharpened, though her heart sank with the weight of what Sarah had confessed. The children were not simply victims of neglect. They were heirs to choices made long before their birth, choices hidden by silence and sealed behind cabin walls. With this understanding, Evelyn felt the urgency deepen, yet to speak too loudly risked stirring a wrath that could turn the whole valley against her. The Griffins, despite their isolation, were woven into the county's fabric. To accuse them openly of carrying a bloodline marked by forbidden ties was to accuse the land itself of breeding secrets too dark to face. She sought out a different kind of counsel, one beyond the courthouse and beyond medicine. Reverend Amos Carter, a minister who had served the holler for decades, agreed to meet her in his weathered parsonage. His eyes were tired but steady, the eyes of a man who had buried more mountain children than he had baptized. Evelyn laid before him Sarah's words, her trembling confession of blood binding too close. The Reverend listened in silence, his hand resting on a well-worn Bible. When he finally spoke, his words were not of condemnation but of sorrow. "These hills," he said, "have always carried their sins in silence. Some families bear scars on the body, others on the soul. The Griffins carry both." He warned her that exposure would not bring quick mercy, for people feared what reflected their own buried truths. But he urged her not to turn away, for silence had already carved too deep into those children's faces. Armed with the Reverend's counsel, Evelyn pressed forward, though danger shadowed her steps. Tom Griffin's suspicion had hardened into something sharper. He began appearing at the edges of town, standing in doorways and alleys, his presence a silent threat. More than once, Evelyn returned home to find footprints in the mud outside her window. Too large to be a child's, too fresh to be ignored. Fear pressed in on her, but so too did the memory of Caleb's rattling cough and Sarah's cracked voice pleading for help. Then came another revelation. In her search, Evelyn obtained a forgotten record from a county clerk, a midwife's ledger from 1927. Scrawled in faded ink was an entry, "Stillborn, Griffin family, second child, pronounced without form." The note struck her like a stone. It suggested that John, Mary, and Caleb were not the first children born under the shadow of the Griffin bloodline. There had been others, lost before life could fully begin. Evelyn held the ledger in trembling hands. The story of the Griffin family was not one of a single tragedy, but of a pattern repeating itself across years, across births, across generations. What she held in that old ledger was proof that the silence had claimed more children than anyone dared imagine. Evelyn carried the fragile book back to her room, the faded ink burning in her thoughts. She traced the midwife's scrawl over and over, imagining the small body wrapped hastily and buried without marker, a child erased before the world could even speak its name. The ledger was not just paper, it was a tombstone that no one else had ever seen. The next day, she presented her discovery to the county board. Officials sat in stiff-backed chairs, their faces betraying unease as she read aloud the entry. Some shifted, others looked to the window rather than meet her gaze. At last, one spoke. "Families in these hills, they bury their dead quietly. Doesn't mean there's wrong in it." His words revealed the old shield of denial, the reflex to protect the valley from its own reflection. Evelyn's voice trembled as she pushed back. "How many children must vanish in silence before it is wrong enough?" The board agreed reluctantly to send another welfare team, this time with authority to intervene. But before action could be taken, news spread that Caleb had grown worse. His cough rattled the cabin at night, and neighbors reported hearing Sarah's cries carried on the wind. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Caleb's small body lay lifeless in his mother's arms, his face still and hollow, his chest finally stilled from the struggle that had defined his short life. The county reacted with a mix of outrage and shame. The papers framed it as a story of neglect, but whispers told a different tale, that Caleb's death was the inevitable consequence of bloodlines folding too tightly. Sarah collapsed into silence once more, her brief voice drowned by grief. Tom hardened like stone, refusing to yield, refusing to admit any fault beyond God's will. Dr. Keller was asked to testify. His medical assessment now turned into a public statement. He spoke not only of malnutrition and sickness, but of conditions bred by isolation and repeated blood ties. His words unsettled the board. Though couched in clinical language, they drew a line between ordinary hardship and the darker truth few dared name aloud. The verdict fell not only on Tom and Sarah, but on the county itself, for allowing years of silence to fester, for letting children grow in shadows until they were lost entirely. In the days after Caleb's burial, Evelyn walked past the Griffin cabin once more. A single shoe sat abandoned by the door, too small to belong to anyone but the boy now gone. She stared at it, unable to look away, the symbol of a child whose voice the hills would never hear again. That small shoe by the door became the county's silent witness, though no one dared move it. Sarah remained inside, shrouded in mourning, while Tom's fury deepened into near paranoia. He patrolled the cabin's edge with a rifle slung across his shoulder, daring anyone to intrude. His grief expressed itself not in tears, but in barricades, in threats, in silence heavier than stone. The welfare board, shaken by the boy's death, finally convened in earnest. Evelyn sat among them, her face pale but resolute. Dr. Keller testified once more, outlining in sober detail the medical consequences of bloodlines confined within themselves. He spoke of fragile bone structures, malformed jaws, and cognitive delays compounded by isolation. His words were clinical, yet each sentence carved deeper into the county's guilt. Still, when the verdict was read, it came with hesitation. The Griffins were to remain under observation, their children mandated for medical and educational oversight. But there would be no removal, no forced separation. Officials claimed it was in the best interest of stability, yet everyone knew the truth. The county feared the backlash of tearing apart one of its oldest families, even if that family's silence had already claimed a life. It was a verdict of compromise, one that weighed mercy against denial, and denial still tipped the scales. For Evelyn, the decision rang hollow. She had expected outrage, perhaps even justice, but instead she found a valley unwilling to fully confront its own reflection. In whispered corners, neighbors still muttered of curses, of God's punishment, of family lines too tangled to unravel. Yet few stepped forward to help Sarah, whose thin frame now seemed to collapse inward, as if grief itself were consuming her. Mary and John remained in the cabin, their faces more withdrawn than ever. Without Caleb's small presence, the silence inside grew unbearable. Evelyn remembered Mary's large, hollow eyes, how they had once followed her with faint curiosity. Now they seemed dulled, as though even that spark had been buried with her brother. The verdict left Evelyn with a choice no less heavy than before: accept the county's quiet compromise, or keep pressing against the walls of silence that had cost so much already. She knew Tom would resist until the last breath, but she also knew Sarah's fleeting voice had been real, proof of a mother's will to break free, however faint. The mountains held their secrets close, but Evelyn believed that silence could not last forever. Somewhere beyond the rifle's watch and the boarded cracks, the truth of the Griffin children still waited to be heard. Yet that truth would never fully step into the daylight. In the years that followed, the Griffins remained in their cabin, their presence a reminder of what the hills could hide and what the county chose not to confront. Mary and John grew taller, but no freer, their faces still carrying the hollow features that made strangers look away. They walked rarely, spoke little, and seemed to fade into the same silence that had consumed their brother. Evelyn Moore eventually left Clay County. The weight of her efforts and the resistance she faced had carved into her spirit. But even miles away, she carried the image of the children with her, their pale faces pressed against wooden slats, their eyes pleading with a silence that no words could shape. She wrote once to a colleague, confessing that the Griffin story was the valley's wound, left open but never treated. Tom Griffin aged into bitterness, his body slowing but his suspicion never fading. He kept the rifle by the door until his final days, as though the outside world were always preparing to invade. Sarah shrank further into quiet submission, her once brief spark extinguished by loss. After her death, neighbors whispered she had passed in her sleep, her hands folded around a child's shoe kept hidden beneath her pillow, the same small shoe Evelyn had once seen abandoned by the door. The county itself moved on. New families arrived, new farms rose, and the Griffins became less a presence than a story told in hushed voices. For some, they were remembered as victims of poverty, for others as the embodiment of forbidden lineage. The truth was never fully agreed upon, but the shadow of their name lingered like smoke in the holler. Years later, when the cabin finally collapsed under the weight of neglect and seasons, children playing in the woods found remnants inside. Broken boards, rusted pots, and among the debris, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. Its surface was clouded, its frame warped by damp, but it still reflected a faint image. Those who looked claimed it seemed to hold not one reflection but several, overlapping faces where only one should have been. The mirror became the final symbol of the Griffin story, not a clear truth but a fractured one, a reflection divided among generations and sealed by silence. In the hollow of Clay County, where hills rose like walls against the sky, the Griffin children's story remained less a memory than a warning, whispered to those who wondered what lay hidden too long behind closed doors.